So we're recording this meeting. All right, in the chat window, I'm putting a word, maladaptive. You're going to see that word on the test. So it's going to ask, how might somebody behave in a maladaptive manner? So I just want to make sure you understand what maladaptive means. Maladaptive means in a bad way. So when we talked about the disorders, if, for instance, somebody's afraid of a spider, how might they behave in a maladaptive way? Well, they might miss dinner because they're so afraid to go into the kitchen because they thought there was a spider in there. So that's maladaptive behavior. So that's what it's asking when I give you that question. Another term that's unrelated to psychology so much, but is related to what's going on right now, is quaranta giorni. If you were to bring up a Google translator and translate that into English, that's actually Italian. And that's Italian for 40 days. So during the Black Plague, the ships that would come in, they would want to know that there's not somebody carrying the Black Plague on that ship, so that the ship would have to sit offshore for 40 days before they would allow it to dock. And so that's where we get the word quarantine from. Okay. We'll talk about the test for a minute. On the last test, one of the things I gave you was to give some defense mechanisms, and I had given you the most common ones during class, and the ones that were most acceptable. But it was obvious that there were a couple people that Googled defense mechanisms and came up with one that I didn't give you. And so, basically that's cheating on a test when you're Googling stuff. So if on one of the questions, you give me something that was not presented in the class or in the book, so it's obvious that you went and Googled that from somewhere, then you're going to get 0 points on that question. Okay, and that also means I have to kind of more restrict the time. I was going to be a little more generous with the time, but because some people are trying to Google stuff and look it up as they go along instead of studying for the test, I'm going to have to restrict the time so that if you don't know the stuff and you're trying to Google it, then you're going to run out of time on the test. So if you have any comments about that, feel free. But right now, that's the way that that's going to be. Okay, so again, that test is on May 8th, Friday, and you'll have that time window to take it, starting at 10 a.m. And then once you start taking it, you will have a limited time to take it. And you'll only see one question at a time. You won't be able to go back. And then I have a pool of questions, so it's going to draw from certain questions. So you may not see the same questions as somebody else. Okay. So Alicia's asking, so we're only used examples that we talked about in class. No, the examples, I expect you to use examples that you didn't come up with class, but with terms. So, like with defense mechanisms, displacement was one of the defense mechanisms. So that was something you could use when you come up with your own example, but you don't come up with a different defense mechanism. So if I ask you about mental disorders and give examples, you're going to use the mental disorders that we've discussed in class and that are in your book. So you're not going to come up with other mental disorders that we didn't talk about, but the examples you come up with on your own. So I need an example that's different than what I gave you. Does that make sense? Okay, of course, if you have any questions, you can ask. Okay. So now we're going to start the lesson. So we talked about prejudice and discrimination last time. And hang on a second, I'm going to go back. Okay. All right, so we talked about prejudice and discrimination. Okay, and prejudice was basically the feeling toward someone or some group, and discrimination is the act of what we do with that. And so now we're looking at the sources of prejudice and discrimination. The sources are learning, mental shortcuts, economic and political competition for limited resources, and displaced aggression, which we call scapegoating, finding a scapegoat. And of course, displacement was one of the defense mechanisms. So under that first category of learning, when we grow up, we've talked before in our past chapters about how we learn things through conditioning. And so people learn prejudice through classical and operant conditioning. They learn prejudice through social learning. So for example, if they have this repeated exposure to the stereotypical portrayals of women and minorities on television and in the movies, that kind of thing teaches children that those kind of images are correct. And so it either initiates prejudice or it reinforces prejudice that they've been learning at home. When they hear parents or teachers or friends express prejudice, that also initiates prejudice. So way back at a certain point of time, it was very common for people to tell jokes that poked fun at ethnic groups or minorities, things like that. When my children were growing up and their grandfather started to tell one of these kind of jokes, I would stop them and say, "You are not going to tell that kind of joke in front of our children." And so what was just kind of a common thing, and people didn't think about it back then, we know that that's the kind of thing that initiates prejudice in young children when they hear these kinds of jokes. So we don't want to be a part of that. People also learn prejudice through direct experience and by generalizing a single negative experience. So somebody has a bad experience with somebody and they happen to be a different ethnic group or a different school group or a different something than they are, they tend to generalize that to the whole group. So maybe somebody's standing in line at the store and somebody wearing a chaparral shirt comes and pushes in front of them, and then they say, "Oh, all those Pumas are just rude, obnoxious people." So they generalize it to the whole group. And then some people get attention for making racist or sexist remarks. When they get that attention, it helps boost their self-esteem. And so that is something that continues to reinforce prejudice in the person. Another source of prejudice is mental shortcuts. We talked before about how our mind is dealing with so much information that it does things like has closure, forces patterns on things, uses schemas to say, okay, I have enough information, I'm going to go with that. So it's not continually processing all this information and getting bogged down. And so mental shortcuts are something that happens sometimes. So prejudice might stem from what are normal attempts in the mind to simplify a very complex social world. So the stereotypes allow people to make very quick judgments about others, and that then frees up their mental resources for other activities. Sometimes these prejudices occur without a person's conscious awareness. That's known as an implicit bias. We know sometimes people are very consciously prejudiced and they know who they hate, but sometimes there's that bias or prejudice within them that they're not really aware of. So maybe they look at somebody that looks to be of Arab descent, and their first thought is, oh, that person must be a terrorist or something like that. So that's an implicit bias. Also, as far as mental shortcuts go, people use stereotypes to classify others in terms of their membership in a group. So people generally see themselves as members of the preferred group or the in group. They tend to think positively of people who are like them. And then other people are the out group. And so that's any other group of people who are not like them. And so they tend to see more diversity in the in group than they do in the out group. Another reason for prejudice is developed from a competition for limited resources. So, throughout history, there's been wars and things like that for a number of reasons, but sometimes it's because there's resources and people want those resources and there's not enough for everybody. So they're competing for those, and then that begins to create prejudice. So that can develop from either economic or political advantages to the dominant group. Another reason is because of displaced aggression. When we get frustrated, that leads people to want to attack that source of frustration. But when that source of frustration is too powerful and and it's very capable of retaliation, okay, we don't want to attack that source directly. And so we then redirect our anger towards some innocent target, which is a scapegoat. And so that ties into what we talked about, the displacement as a defense mechanism, where we can't take it out directly against the aggressor, so we find somebody a more innocent target. So we blame somebody for something, and then that can create prejudice. Now, often in class, we have kind of discussions on people who are free of prejudice, but just some things to think about. Are you truly free of prejudice? If you are going off to college and you're going to be in a dorm, would you feel comfortable being in a dorm with somebody who is a different sexual orientation than you? If you were heterosexual, would you be okay with somebody who's homosexual? If you're homosexual, would you be okay with somebody who's heterosexual? Do you have negative feelings toward some of the teams we've competed against, like Nighthawks or Pumas? Okay, people like that. So sometimes we believe we're free of prejudice, but if we really dig down, sometimes we find little things that would make us uncomfortable. So that's something, we want to reflect on. Now, we use psychology then to figure out what causes people to be prejudiced and what we can do to try to minimize those kinds of things. We talked about destructive obedience. Okay, what can we do to reduce those kinds of things? So how can we reduce prejudice and discrimination? Okay, one way is to encourage cooperation and common goals. So this is cooperation, not competition. Okay, if we're competing against other people, then that creates prejudice. And you can't just throw people together and assume that that's going to reduce prejudice. You look at a neighborhood, sometimes people move into a neighborhood that are different ethnic makeup, a different nationality, and people begin to develop prejudice against those individuals. So just putting people together doesn't reduce prejudice. But if there's some superordinate goal that they all have to work towards, when they have to work together to achieve that goal, then that is something that reduces that kind of prejudice. So we've seen that in situations where there's been like natural disasters, like hurricanes that have destroyed regions in the south, and people have to work together in order to survive. And after that, where they've been having to work together in order to survive, we see a reduction in prejudice at that time. So that's working together toward a common goal, working together to overcome a crisis, not just throwing people together. Okay, that just throwing people together can create more prejudice. They have to be have a certain interdependence and an equal status in order to have a good experience. Another way we can reduce prejudice is cognitive retraining. So people are prejudiced, so we begin to talk to them and explain to them and make them think about another person's perspective and begin to pay attention to similarities between the groups. Another way is to employ cognitive dissonance. Now, we said sometimes people have a bad experience with one person and they generalize that to the entire group. Well, if somebody has this prejudice and they meet somebody from that group who doesn't match their stereotype, well, one time they might think, okay, that's just, one-off big deal. But if they continue to experience that meeting of people who don't match that stereotype, that begins to create that cognitive dissonance. Their attitudes don't match their experience. And so then they're going to have to change their attitude in order to match the experience. And so that's something that if we have enough exceptions to their stereotype, then we can reduce that prejudice. Now, we talked about destructive obedience. And so how can we reduce destructive obedience? Okay, we said that authority is important and that obeying can help our life and make sure we don't have just social chaos. However, there are those who abuse power, okay? And at that point, the obedience can be destructive. So we're socialized to obey in order to avoid this chaos, but sometimes that's so deeply ingrained that we become mindless to people telling us to have immoral requests, like the Nazis and the prison guards that the Americans had at the Abu Ghraib prison. Now we're just following orders. Okay, so we really have to be mindful of the things that people ask us to do and not just say, well, they're the authority. If it doesn't seem right, we have to question that. Another is to recognize the power of the situation. It's easy to step back and say, oh, I wouldn't do it. If we were in a classroom, I would start to get closer to somebody. And as I get closer, their focus, instead of being broad, begins to get real narrow, and it begins to create a little anxiety. Okay, being in the situation is a lot different than looking outside. When there is somebody in authority right there telling you to do something, that's a very powerful situation. And so we have to recognize that there's appropriate relationships or guidelines. Okay, there are appropriate things between a parent and a child. There's appropriate things between a teacher and a student. And so sometimes it becomes difficult to recognize when that behavior becomes maladaptive. But again, if something seems wrong, if you begin to feel anxiety from the request, you need to recognize that and say, this may not be appropriate. I need to not obey in this case. We talked about groupthink, and so we have to protect against groupthink. When we think, oh, Americans would never do something like that, that's a form of groupthink. Okay, studies show, just like in Zimbardo's Stanford prison study, you assume the role that you are given and you begin to change. So we have to recognize that when we're in a group, if somebody's trying to speak up, we can't just silence them. Okay, and have that whole group think, okay, we're all on the same page here, when really we're not. We have to avoid the foot in the door technique. We have to recognize that when somebody asks us a little favor and then asks us another favor, and they continue to grow in their request, that could be leading to something big that we wouldn't have never agreed to in the first place. And so we have to avoid that foot in the door technique by knowing at some point that I have to say no. We've got to be able to say no to some request. Okay, and keep yourself out of trouble. We want to guard against a relaxed moral guard. Okay, we said that the presence of the authority figure, that there's somebody wearing a lab coat, so they must know what they're doing. They must be a good person. They wouldn't ask us to do something evil. Okay, don't think that only somebody who seems evil is going to do evil things. Okay, the people in the study that were part of the Milgram experiment, most of them went all the way in delivering that full shock to the person, okay, because that experimenter was not seen as a corrupt or evil person. So their moral guard was down. And when the moral guard is down, that can maximize obedience. And then a strong influence is disobedient models. Okay, we have to be alert to immoral forms of punishment. And so we need that courage to stand up and say no. Okay, we saw the example of Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat. We saw examples in the Milgram experiment when we had two disobedient models, people were far less likely then to go all the way. So that's something in your life that you have to recognize. Sometimes that we get this group mob behavior that people start doing things they would have never done. But when there's somebody that stands up and says, no, we can't be doing this, okay, that can make a huge difference. All right, another part of social psychology is our actions towards others. And one of those actions is aggression, which is any behavior that's intended to harm someone. So what causes this aggression? One might be biological factors. There might be some instinctive aggressive behavior in order for us to survive. There might be aggression in our genes and our nervous system. People we know that are engaging in substance abuse tend to be more aggressive. Some mental disorders will lead to more aggression. And then, of course, hormones and neurotransmitters can lead to more aggression. For instance, the male hormone testosterone is associated with a greater level of aggression. Okay, homicide rates are higher among men, and they're higher among men with schizophrenia and antisocial disorders, particularly if they abuse alcohol. Okay, there's social factors in aggression. So we just mentioned that substance abuse and alcohol use is a major factor in many forms of aggression. Aversive stimuli can cause people to be aggressive. There are some things that bother people, like noise. Some people are very affected by noise and they become very agitated with lots of noise. Heat is something that can be aversive. Pain, people getting insults, foul odors, okay, all of these kinds of things can increase aggression. And so these aversive stimuli or frustrations creates that anger, which then leads to aggression. Culture and learning can cause aggression. Those who are raised in a culture with aggressive models will learn aggressive behavior. Frustration. When we get frustrated, frustration creates anger, and for some people, then this anger can lead to violence. And then the media, we have study after study that correlates violent media to increased levels of aggression. Studies have found that exposure to TV violence increases aggression in children, and that aggressive children tend to seek out more violent programming. There's a question that's going to appear on the test. Okay, violent programming causes children to be more aggressive, and aggressive children tend to seek out more violent programming. Okay, so how do we control this aggression then? Some people have proposed some kind of catharsis, that you just work it out, like you go home and you just, okay, I got all this aggression, I'm just going to go home and I'm going to beat my pillow. But studies have really shown that when you engaged in this aggressive behavior, that tends to make you more aggressive. So it's not really something that works. Something that does work is to introduce things that are incompatible to the aggression, like humor. Okay, when things are beginning to heat up, when somebody can introduce a little humor into a situation, that can begin to calm down the situation and make people less aggressive. Another is to improve social skills. Okay, sometimes people don't have the communication skills to know how to ask for help. And so by helping people learn to ask for help, to help them improve their social skills, that can make them less frustrated, and then they become less aggressive. So we need to help people learn to express what they want. Now, another concept of our action towards others is altruism. Altruism are actions that are designed to help others with no obvious benefit to the helper. Okay, we're helping them not because we're going to get something out of it, but because they need the help. And we see a picture here. In January of 2009, that U.S. Airways jet hit a flock of birds on takeoff, and it took out both engines. And the pilot, Chelsea Sullenberger, was able to successfully crash land that plane in the Hudson River. And because of the actions of Sullenberger and the flight crew, and because of nearby boats that came to the rescue and the first responders, the New York police and fire squads, every person on that plane was saved. Okay, so people sprang into action to help. So now we ask, why do we help? There's several theories on why we help. One is the evolutionary model, that we want our species to survive, and so we're going to help people to survive so our species survives. Another is the egoistic model, that helping is motivated by some anticipated gain. We hope that later they're going to reciprocate and they'll help us, and so that's why we help, not necessarily because we just want to help this person so much. We just want to have that help when we need it, so we'll help now, expecting something else. Another part of that is sometimes people feel guilty if they see somebody that needs help and they don't help. So they're going to help not because that person needs it, but in order to alleviate the guilt that they're feeling if they don't help. And then we have the empathy altruism model, that when we see somebody else's suffering, we have empathy, we can feel that suffering. And so we want to help that person for his or her own sake. We want to help them to alleviate their suffering. And so that's altruism, when we're helping because the person needs help, not because we're going to get anything out of it. All right, so here's just a little chart that kind of shows those three models: the evolutionary method or model, that we want to survive, so we're going to help; the egoistic model, that if somebody's in distress, somebody needs help that's causing us distress, we're annoyed or we're anxious or something, so we want to reduce that stress, so we're going to help them so we don't feel bad. And then there's the empathy model, that we have compassion for that person, and so we're going to help them to reduce their stress. Now, sometimes people don't help. So why don't people help? Well, Latane and Darley have a 5-step diffusion model. So there's this diffusion of responsibility. We use that in the Milgram experiment. Okay, that sense of responsibility or the diffusion of responsibility. There's times when people were asked, well, why didn't you call the police? And they said, well, with all that was going on, I thought somebody else would have called the police. So they're not taking that personal responsibility. So in this 5-step process, I say, number one, of course, is you have to notice the incident. If you don't notice it, then obviously you're not going to help. So yes, you notice it. Do you interpret that as an emergency? You see somebody lying on the ground. Do you think, oh, they're just there taking a nap? Or do you think, uh-oh, something's wrong with that person. They're lying on the ground. After that, do you accept personal responsibility? And that's one of the key things. Sometimes people say, well, if they really needed help, somebody would have called for help already. So I guess they don't need help. Or do you think, wow, somebody's lying on the ground, I need to get them help? And then the last part of that is, if you decide they need help, do you know how to help? You're going to go over and push them and say, hey, are you awake? Or are you going to call 911? Do you know how to help in whatever the situation is? And if those 4 things happen, then we get to the 5th step where help is given. So that diffusion of responsibility is a big thing. So how do I know if the person needs help? What if it's unclear? Well, ask. If you're not sure if the person needs help, you can ask them, hey, dude, do you need some help? Now, if there's more people around, are you more likely to get help? Or if there's more people around, are you less likely to get help? This is something called the bystander effect. In one study, people were put in a room and then they began to pump smoke into the room. If people were alone, then the time that it took for them to respond, they tended to respond very quickly. When people were in the room in a group, much more time elapsed before people began to respond to the smoke, because people thought, oh, if there's a problem, then I should be able to, somebody's going to do something about it. So now we're going to look at a little 3-minute video here on this bystander effect.
Place like this street in New York City, if you were unfortunate enough to be the victim of a crime or taken ill unexpectedly, you might think that surrounded by all these people, someone would intervene. After all, isn't there safety in numbers? Psychologists say no. Research suggests that often a victim is less likely to receive assistance when surrounded by a group rather than a single bystander. When people are in a crowd, it's easier to pass the buck. It's what psychologists call the diffusion of responsibility. Liverpool Street Station in London, a busy thoroughfare for commuters. Unknown to these passers-by, Peter is an actor. As part of an experiment on bystander apathy, he's pretending to be ill.
Help! Help!
How long before he gets help?
Please, somebody. Help! Help me, somebody. Please help me.
Helping would be inconvenient or even risky. He lies there for more than 20 minutes and no one raises an eyebrow.
Please, somebody help me.
It's always very distressing to watch situations like this where people are obviously suffering and no one's actually helping them. But what we have here is 2 conflicting rules. One is the rule that we ought to help, and the other is the rule that we ought to do what everybody else is doing. And here you have effectively a group of strangers who are exerting the pressure not to intervene, not to help. And it's very difficult to rebel.
Ruth, another actor, takes Peter's place. How long before she receives help? 4 minutes later, and 34 people have passed without stopping.
Well, people don't really want to know. They just haven't got the time. Well, they have got the time, they just don't want to get involved.
Unwittingly, these strangers have silently formed a temporary group with a rule: don't get involved. They're afraid to stand out from the crowd and won't take action if no one else does. This woman has clearly spotted Ruth, but she conforms to the rule and does nothing. Watch what happens, though, when someone else helps.
You all right? You all right?
Yes, thank you.
Sure, you look a bit clicky, you know what I mean?
She suddenly finds herself in a different group with a new rule: to help.
You want to sit up?
She don't look well, does she?
You all right? Yeah. Sure.
First I thought she was dead. Then I checked to see if she was breathing or not. And I looked around and I couldn't believe that no one had noticed her, because there was a bloke sat there just absorbed in reading a newspaper.
This time, Peter's dressed as a respectable gentleman. Now that his dress is in keeping with those around him, how long before he's rescued?
Hello, sir. How are you today?
I'm all right.
6 seconds. She even calls him sir, and suddenly everyone's a good Samaritan.
Do you suffer from epilepsy?
No.
Why you're lying on the floor in the rain?
Because he's part of the right group, everyone wants to help.
I would just hate to be in his position of feeling ill and nobody helping and walking past, so I'd just like to check that he was okay.
And I thought, well, it's wet, so he must really be ill because he's going to ruin his suit anyway.
Okay. So now you get an idea of why I wear a tie when I go out. So if something happens, I'll get the help. All right, so you saw that, somebody's laying there and people are walking by. People are basically forming that group, and they're thinking if that person needed help, then somebody would have helped them. And so people aren't getting help. But when one person did, had that one model that helped, then we saw that other people began to help. Okay, so that's the bystander effect. Now, also in our sociology and looking at how we interact with others, we're getting to the last part of that, and that's interpersonal attraction, our positive feelings towards others. And so there's some key factors to interpersonal attraction. The first is physical attractiveness. Before you begin to date somebody or something like that, that physical attractiveness is one of the initial things that get us to look at somebody or think we might like them or something like that. When we look at other people, okay, attractive people are seen as more poised, interesting, cooperative, intelligent, achieving, sociable, independent, healthy, and sexually warm than unattractive people. Of course, what is seen as beautiful varies from era to era, from culture to culture. Okay, and people don't tend to hold out for somebody who's ideally attractive. Both men and women tend to select partners whose physical attractiveness approximately matches their own. Now, people begin to use some nonverbal behavior to increase their attractiveness, and that's flirting. And so that's one way they signal their interest. Another key factor is proximity. Now, proximity does not mean, okay, I like somebody when they're close. What this means is when we tend to see people over and over again, we then begin to warm up to them. So there might be somebody that, the first day of school, they're sitting somewhere near you in class and you don't pay a lot of attention to them. But each day you come into class, each day you see them, and you begin to warm up to them, and eventually maybe you become friends or even beyond that. So proximity means the repeated contact with somebody tends to increase that liking of that person. And then, of course, one thing we've talked about, the major factor in relationships is similarity in social background and values. Okay, that idea, birds of a feather flock together. Okay, that holds true for both liking relationships and loving relationships. We make friends with people that are similar to us. We fall in love with people and have good relationships with people who are similar to us. When we talk about opposites attract, mostly that's personality traits that people have that are different than ours, and so that tends to complete the relationship by giving us something we may lack. Now, there's romantic love and there's companionate love. Okay, that romantic love is that very intense attraction and excitement. And so that's largely based on mystery and fantasy. When we first fall in love, we have this idea of what the person is and what they're like, and we have all this fantasy. And so we fall in love with what we want the other person to be. But then these illusions and this intense attraction and that excitement, that romantic love, begins to fade as we begin to really know the person and interact with them. And so in about 6 to 12 months, okay, after that relationship begins, we begin to see the realities of daily living. Compassionate love, on the other hand, is a very strong, lasting attraction that's based on admiration, respect, trust, deep caring, and commitment. And so the satisfaction with that relationship grows with time as we begin to recognize the value of the companionship and the intimacy of the relationship. If you overlook your partner's faults, then you are more satisfied with that relationship. We look at that feeling of cognitive dissonance again. If I'm focusing on their faults, then I'm feeling, well, my attitude of this being a good relationship is not matching my experience, and then we begin to have trouble. So when we look at realistic expectations that nobody is perfect, if this person has certain faults that we can live with, then we just overlook those and we have a very good relationship. If we focus on people's faults, then we're not going to have a good relationship. Okay, Sternberg has this triarchy theory, and I'm not going to ask you questions about this on the test, but basically he's saying that there's these 3 different areas: intimacy, passion, and commitment. And that if we just have one, then we don't have a complete relationship. To have that consummate love, that full love, we need a balance of intimacy and passion and commitment. So intimacy is that emotional closeness and that connectedness, that mutual trust, that warmth, where people are forming love maps that we talked about. Passion is the sexual attraction and the desirability, the physical excitement, that state of intense longing. And commitment is that permanence and that stability, that decision to stay in that relationship for the long haul. So he's saying we need a healthy degree of all 3. If we just have one, then we're going to have things that don't balance and then may cause that relationship not to last. So romantic love is different from companionate love. Romantic love is that mystery and fantasy. Companionate love is that strong and lasting relationship. And then 3 key factors I gave you in interpersonal attraction are physical attractiveness first. Proximity can get us to begin to like somebody, and of course similarity is the key factor. And then Sternberg's theory, I'm not going to ask you about that, but his 3 things are intimacy, passion, and commitment. And so now that is the end of chapter 15. And if we were in classroom, I'd ask you to spend some time and look back over the psychology course and think of the things that you could use in your life. So we've learned a lot of things, and there's things that you could actually apply in your life. I don't know how many courses you can think back and think, yeah, here's something I can use in my life. But you might take a little time to reflect over that. So since we finished chapter 15, that's our final chapter. We won't have a live class on Wednesday, and then Friday, you'll have that test window that opens at 10 o'clock in the morning. Okay, and then next week you'll have a final exam, probably about Wednesday. I'll send you out what the final exam is about, so you don't have to stress over that. That's not going to be something that's, you know, terrible and stressful and all that kind of thing. So it's going to be good. So you need to worry about right now is the test on Friday, and make sure you've studied for that test. Okay, so do we have any questions?
I did have a question.
Okay.
I was wondering how many questions were going to be on the test.
The test is going to have 40 questions that are either, no, I'm sorry, 42 questions that are either multiple choice or fill in the blank or matching, that kind of question. And then it's going to have 2 free response questions.
And is it the same time frame as the last test that we took?
It's going to be a little more time because the last test, you know, only gave you 20 questions. This one you have the 42. So I'm going to give you a little bit longer, like a full block period, and then maybe just a little bit extra. Okay. I was going to give you like a longer time, but because people are trying to spend too much time looking up things, I'm shortening it down, but you will have longer than the last test.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Okay, if you think of any other questions, then you can certainly email me with your questions and I'll help you out. Miss you guys and hope everything's going well with you. So thank you for showing up. I really appreciate it. Hang in there and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay.